Welcome to this session on zoning for climate-responsive cities. In this lecture, we will explore how zoning, which is one of the most powerful instruments of spatial planning, can be reimagined to support cities in responding to the complex challenges of climate change. Traditionally, zoning has been used to organize urban functions, regulate density, and control development patterns. However, in an era defined by rising temperatures, increasing flood risks and growing urban inequality, these conventional approaches are no longer sufficient. Climate-responsive zoning therefore calls for a new perspective that moves from static regulation toward adaptive governance, in which land use decisions actively enhance urban resilience, environmental performance, and social well-being. Throughout this presentation, we will examine theoretical foundations, practical instruments, and global case studies that illustrate how zoning can become a catalyst for sustainable and climate-resilient urban transformation. This presentation is structured to guide you through the evolving role of zoning in the context of climate-responsive urban development. We begin by clarifying the learning objectives and establishing why zoning is a critical instrument for enhancing urban resilience. The discussion then moves from traditional, static zoning approaches toward more adaptive frameworks that respond to uncertainty, climate risk, and environmental change. We examine how land use regulation interacts with climate systems, shaping urban form, microclimate, and exposure to hazards. Building on this foundation, the presentation introduces climate-responsive design principles and regulatory tools that support climate-sensitive urbanism, including the integration of blue-green infrastructure and adaptive zoning strategies for flood and heat risk. Governance and institutional frameworks are then addressed, highlighting the importance of coordination, capacity, and data-driven decision-making, supported by digital tools and emerging technologies. The theoretical and methodological discussion is complemented by international case studies from Rotterdam and New York City, which illustrate how zoning reforms are implemented in practice. The presentation concludes by addressing equity and climate justice considerations, and by synthesizing key lessons toward more integrated zoning approaches that support resilient, inclusive, and climate-responsive cities. Historically, zoning emerged as a rational planning instrument designed to manage industrial expansion, safeguard public health, and establish spatial order within rapidly growing cities. By separating incompatible land uses and regulating density, it offered predictability and control. However, this rigid, function-based approach often produced fragmented urban patterns and limited the city's capacity to adapt to environmental change. Today, the increasing frequency of climate-related risks requires a shift in how we understand and apply zoning. Rather than serving merely as a mechanism of control, zoning is now recognized as an adaptive governance tool that supports learning, flexibility, and transformation within urban systems. Through the regulation of density, urban form, and land use intensity, zoning directly shapes environmental performance and resilience. Decisions about how land is allocated, how buildings are arranged, and how open spaces connect to ecological systems influence heat exposure, flood risk, and energy efficiency. In this way, zoning becomes not only a regulatory framework but also a dynamic mediator between the built environment and the natural systems on which cities depend. Zoning systems were originally created to provide stability and predictability in urban development. They sought to organize land uses, prevent conflicts, and maintain a sense of order within the growing industrial city. However, the complex realities of the 21st century, such as climate change, rapid technological progress, and evolving social needs, have exposed the limitations of this fixed and prescriptive approach. Adaptive zoning offers an alternative way of thinking by transforming zoning from a static legal framework into a dynamic process of learning and adjustment. Instead of focusing solely on what can be built, it emphasizes how urban development performs over time in relation to environmental and social goals. It introduces regular review cycles, scenario-based planning, and data-informed evaluation so that local authorities can respond to emerging risks and new opportunities. Through this transformation, zoning becomes an instrument of resilience rather than rigidity. It enables cities to remain responsive, to integrate new knowledge, and to align land use, density, and environmental performance with the broader objective of long-term sustainability. The relationship between land use and climate systems lies at the heart of climate-responsive urban planning. Every decision about density, building form, and land use mix has measurable consequences for energy consumption, air quality, and local microclimates. The configuration of the urban landscape determines how sunlight reaches the ground, how air circulates through city blocks, and how heat and moisture are stored or released. Compact and high-density development can reduce transport-related emissions and strengthen social interaction, yet it can also intensify heat island effects if green and permeable surfaces are neglected. Similarly, extensive impervious coverage can increase flood vulnerability, whereas integrating blue-green infrastructure can moderate temperature and enhance stormwater retention. Climate-responsive planning therefore requires a holistic perspective that links urban morphology with environmental processes. By using climatic, biophysical, and socio-economic data together, planners can design zoning codes that are both place-specific and adaptive, ensuring that urban form evolves in harmony with the natural systems that sustain it. Climate-responsive design lies at the intersection of architecture, urban planning, and environmental science. It is rooted in the understanding that urban form must not resist natural processes but instead work with them. The design of streets, buildings, and open spaces influences solar access, air movement, and surface temperatures, which together determine the comfort and energy performance of urban environments. To achieve this, planners and designers should optimize density gradients to balance ventilation and shading while protecting ecological corridors and maintaining permeable surfaces for stormwater absorption. Orientation-based design and solar zoning help ensure that each development responds to the local sunpath, prevailing winds, and topography. Climate-responsive planning also calls for a shift from prescriptive land use regulation to performance-oriented zoning. Rather than simply dictating what functions may occur, this approach evaluates how spatial forms perform under different climatic conditions. By combining compact or dispersed urban forms according to context, cities can simultaneously reduce emissions, moderate heat, and enhance livability. In the context of climate-sensitive urbanism, regulatory tools must extend beyond traditional zoning codes. The challenge is not only to define where and how we build but also to create the institutional capacity to govern adaptation processes over time. This involves integrating resilience goals directly into legal and administrative frameworks so that climate considerations become a prerequisite for development approval, rather than an optional add-on. Economic and fiscal instruments also play a crucial role. Mechanisms such as adaptation funds, climate-linked fees, and tax incentives can mobilize private investment for public resilience outcomes. These tools transform abstract environmental targets into actionable, financeable interventions. Equally important is the role of data and participation. Adaptive governance requires continuous monitoring, transparent reporting, and collaboration between citizens, planners, and decision-makers. Through these combined regulatory, economic, and participatory mechanisms, cities can evolve from compliance-oriented planning toward proactive, learning-based climate governance. Blue-green infrastructure represents a fundamental shift in how we conceive and regulate urban space. Instead of treating water and vegetation as residual or decorative elements, this approach recognizes them as essential systems that support urban resilience. By embedding ecosystem services directly into the spatial and legal framework of cities, planners can transform ecological processes into infrastructure that delivers measurable social, environmental, and economic benefits. Zoning plays a crucial role in this process. Through requirements such as minimum permeable surface ratios, mandatory green roofs, and riparian buffer zones, regulatory frameworks can ensure that every parcel contributes to ecological performance. At the metropolitan scale, connecting wetlands, parks, and waterways forms a blue-green network that mitigates floods, moderates urban heat, and enhances biodiversity. The case of Singapore's active, beautiful, clean waters program illustrates how ecological thinking can become embedded in zoning and development codes. By linking environmental design with clear regulatory guidance, cities can achieve both environmental sustainability and climate resilience in a coherent and measurable way. Adaptive zoning represents a new generation of regulatory practice that connects spatial planning directly to evolving climate risks. Instead of relying on static, once-approved maps, this approach uses dynamic GIS data to continuously update zoning designations based on real-time information about flood levels, surface temperatures, and hazard probabilities. Through adaptive zoning, local governments can create resilient districts and climate overlay zones that apply context-specific design and development standards in vulnerable areas. For example, Rotterdam has pioneered flood-adaptive zoning that combines mixed-use waterfront redevelopment with multifunctional dikes, turning protective infrastructure into public space. Similarly, following Hurricane Sandy, New York City amended its zoning code to allow building elevation, flexible setbacks, and climate-resilient retrofits without violating existing regulations. This data-driven, feedback-based approach transforms zoning into a living instrument of climate governance. It enables continuous learning, scenario testing, and regulatory agility, ensuring that cities remain responsive to both short-term hazards and long-term climatic uncertainty. Governance and institutional design form the backbone of any successful climate-sensitive planning system. Even the most technically advanced zoning regulations are ineffective without coherent coordination among the institutions responsible for their implementation. Effective governance therefore requires collaboration between national ministries, regional authorities, and local municipalities so that environmental, planning, and disaster management policies reinforce rather than contradict one another. Decentralization plays a critical role in this process. When local governments have both the authority and capacity to interpret national guidelines, they can adapt regulatory frameworks to their own climatic, social, and economic realities. This allows for a bottom-up form of resilience planning that reflects community priorities while remaining aligned with national objectives. A strong example can be found in Japan, where the Land Readjustment and Resilience Planning Act integrates redevelopment, disaster risk reduction, and infrastructure design into a unified institutional process. This model demonstrates that resilience is not only a technical outcome but also an institutional achievement, grounded in coordination, trust, and long-term governance continuity. Data and digital technologies are transforming the way cities plan for resilience. Geographic information systems and artificial intelligence now allow planners to move beyond static maps toward dynamic, scenario-based modeling. By integrating real-time environmental and socio-economic data, cities can identify which areas are most exposed to flooding, heat stress, or energy inefficiency and can test different regulatory or design responses before they are implemented. Analytical platforms such as Urban Footprint and ArcGIS Urban, QGIS exemplify this new generation of decision support tools. They combine spatial data, climate projections, and land use models to simulate how zoning decisions influence emissions, accessibility, and risk distribution across a metropolitan area. These digital systems do more than visualize information, they create the foundation for data-driven governance. By enabling continuous monitoring and interagency data sharing, they make urban planning more transparent, adaptive, and evidence-based, that is a crucial step toward building cities that can learn and evolve in the face of uncertainty. Rotterdam provides one of the world's most influential examples of how a city can integrate flood risk management into its spatial planning and zoning frameworks. Situated in a delta region that lies largely below sea level, Rotterdam has transformed its vulnerability into an opportunity for design innovation. The city's adaptive waterfront zoning approach links urban development with hydraulic engineering, ensuring that each new district contributes to flood protection, water storage, and climate adaptation. Projects such as the water squares at Bentham Plain and the multifunctional dike systems along the Maas River exemplify this philosophy. These spaces serve dual purposes, functioning as recreational and cultural venues in dry conditions while retaining stormwater during heavy rainfall. Institutional collaboration has been critical to this success. Partnerships among the municipality, water boards, universities, and private developers have produced a governance culture grounded in learning and experimentation. The key lesson from Rotterdam is that resilience emerges not from isolated infrastructure projects, but from the capacity of planning systems to integrate risk management, ecological design, and urban livability within a flexible and adaptive regulatory framework. New York City offers a powerful example of how legal and institutional adaptability can transform crisis into opportunity. After Hurricane Sandy in 2012, the city initiated the Resilient Neighborhoods Initiative, a pioneering program that worked directly with local communities to redesign zoning and development regulations in flood-prone areas. This initiative recognized that resilience cannot be imposed through top-down mandates alone. It must be built collaboratively through inclusive planning and localized governance. The city subsequently introduced a series of zoning text amendments that allowed property owners to elevate buildings, install green retrofits, and adopt energy-efficient systems without violating pre-existing regulations. The creation of special coastal risk districts formalized this adaptive approach, setting differentiated standards for density, setbacks, and materials depending on exposure to coastal hazards. These changes were embedded within a broader strategic framework, 1 NYC 2050, which integrates climate resilience with social equity and environmental justice. The central lesson from New York City is that legal adaptability and community engagement are as essential to resilience as physical infrastructure. By aligning policy innovation with social inclusion, the city has turned adaptive zoning into a cornerstone of climate-responsive governance. This slide presents the Singapore case through the lens of performance-based green urbanism. The LUSH program, which stands for Landscaping for Urban Spaces and High-Rises, promotes the integration of green infrastructure not only in horizontal open spaces but also within high-rise buildings and dense urban environments. In this context, the green plot ratio targets established for both private and public developments make the level of urban greenery a measurable and controllable planning criterion. Applications such as vertical greening, rooftop gardens, and sky terraces represent the spatial outcomes of this approach. The second emphasis of the slide is the integration of zoning decisions with environmental data. In Singapore, the zoning system is linked to microclimate modeling, biodiversity corridors, and environmental performance indicators, moving beyond a development logic based solely on aesthetics or density. In this process, coordination among institutions such as the Urban Redevelopment Authority, the National Parks Board, and the Building and Construction Authority enables environmental goals to be effectively incorporated into planning and implementation processes. As a result, urban development is understood not merely as physical growth, but as a transformation process that enhances environmental quality. Finally, the measurable impacts of this approach are particularly significant. Reductions in temperature in high-density districts, increases in urban biodiversity, and improvements in overall livability are among the main outcomes of the Singapore model. For this reason, Singapore represents a strong case study demonstrating the positive effects of green zoning on health, livability, and resilience, while also offering a replicable model for climate-responsive and ecologically productive cities. This image presents a concrete example of the performance-based green urbanism approach developed within Singapore's high-density urban fabric. The vertical planting systems integrated into building facades, terrace gardens, and elevated green connections demonstrate that nature is reintroduced into the city not only at ground level but also at the scale of the building itself. Beyond creating an aesthetic green appearance, this approach provides multidimensional environmental benefits, including microclimate improvement, temperature reduction, support for air quality, and enhancement of biodiversity. At the same time, it contributes to the creation of a healthier and more resilient urban environment by improving the quality of life in areas dominated by dense development. In this respect, the Singapore case can be regarded as an important example that illustrates how green infrastructure can be integrated into high-rise building topologies and offers a strong model for climate-responsive urban design. This image illustrates Singapore's approach to green infrastructure as a strategy that is considered not only at the scale of individual buildings, but also across the city as a whole and within the public space system. The aerial photograph at the top reveals the relationship between coastal areas, large-scale green open spaces, and planned urban development. This integrated structure offers a model in which natural systems are incorporated into urban planning, and ecological continuity is addressed together with public accessibility. In the case of Singapore, green spaces are regarded not merely as recreational areas, but also as strategic infrastructure elements that support climate adaptation, environmental performance, and urban livability. The lower image, through the example of Jewel Changi Airport, demonstrates a public space experience in which architecture and landscape are closely intertwined within an enclosed yet ecologically designed setting. The dense planting, water features, and circulation areas created beneath the wide-span glass roof show how nature can be deliberately introduced into an artificial interior environment. This approach is significant because it demonstrates that biophilic design principles can be applied even in high-density and technologically advanced urban contexts. At the same time, it reflects how factors such as user comfort, visual quality, microclimatic regulation, and psychological well-being are becoming increasingly central in contemporary urban design and architectural practice. Equity and climate justice are essential considerations in climate-responsive zoning, since the benefits and burdens of environmental change are not distributed evenly across urban populations. While zoning reforms have the potential to reduce climate risk, they can also deepen social inequalities if they lead to rising property values, displacement, or the concentration of green amenities in already advantaged neighborhoods. To avoid these outcomes, zoning must incorporate explicit mechanisms that promote fairness and inclusion. This includes combining climate adaptation goals with affordable housing requirements, guaranteeing equitable access to parks and ecological infrastructure, and ensuring that resilience investments do not inadvertently marginalize low-income or historically underserved communities. Procedural justice is equally important, as communities must have a genuine voice in shaping the policies that affect their everyday lives. Durban provides a compelling example of how community participation can reshape zoning for climate adaptation. Through participatory mapping and neighborhood-level engagement, the city developed a framework that links local knowledge with formal planning processes. This approach demonstrates that climate resilience is not only about adapting physical systems but also about supporting social resilience through inclusive, just, and community-centered planning. Moving toward integrated zoning for climate-responsive cities requires a fundamental shift in how planning systems define and coordinate their objectives. Rather than treating adaptation, mitigation, and social equity as separate themes, integrated zoning merges these priorities into a single policy framework. This ensures that climate resilience measures support decarbonization goals and that both are implemented in a way that advances fairness and inclusion. Achieving this requires cross-sectoral and multi-scalar collaboration. Urban planning cannot operate in isolation from transportation agencies, water authorities, energy providers, housing organizations, or environmental institutions. Similarly, climate-responsive zoning must be coordinated across neighborhood, citywide, regional, and national scales, since climate risks and urban development pressures move across administrative boundaries. Finally, integrated zoning depends on continuous monitoring and feedback. Cities must use measurable indicators such as greenhouse gas emissions, surface permeability, hazard exposure, and access to green space to evaluate progress and refine zoning codes over time. By linking planning data with regulatory updates, cities can move from static regulation toward a dynamic, learning-based model of climate governance that supports sustainable and resilient urban futures. As we conclude this module, it becomes clear that zoning is no longer simply a mechanism for regulating land use. Instead, it has become an adaptive governance tool that can help cities respond to accelerating climate risks and complex socio-economic challenges. When zoning frameworks incorporate flexibility, periodic review, and data-informed decision-making, they contribute to more resilient and equitable urban futures. Climate-responsive zoning also depends on broadening the sources of knowledge that inform planning decisions. Integrating environmental science, microclimate data, social vulnerability assessments, and community priorities ensures that spatial regulations reflect the realities of both ecological systems and human needs. Looking ahead, the future of zoning will increasingly rely on predictive modeling, artificial intelligence, and participatory technologies. These tools allow cities to test scenarios, anticipate hazards, and adapt regulations proactively. Finally, no zoning reform can succeed without strong institutional foundations. Public engagement, capacity building, and cross-sectoral coordination underpin effective implementation. These elements ensure that climate-responsive zoning is not only technically sound but also socially legitimate and institutionally durable.